Sensitive content. Viewer discretion is advised. Almost 3 weeks ago, my boyfriend died unexpectedly in his home. We live separately. Before he passed, my cat would curl up and sleep on his side of the bed near his pillow when he wasn't here. Since then, he hasn't laid there once and has instead been sleeping down by my feet. Normally, I would think it was due to the colder weather or to comfort me while grieving, but last night he jumped from the nightstand completely over his side as if he was avoiding the whole area instead of just walking across the bed like he would normally do. Last night, I dreamt we were doing mundane things like shopping together and spooning outside in the grass. It was the most realistic feeling dream I've felt since he died. Any other cat-related stories? I guess I'm desperately looking for signs that his spirit is still with me. Locational context. I live on a farm on the side of a mountain in the middle of nowhere in British Columbia's interior. No cell service, neighbours are beyond shouting distance. A very on-your-own lifestyle out here. My trailer is at the top of this property next to a barn, surrounded 360 degrees with forest, except for the little road up here. The mountain Mount Ida has a long history with the Aboriginal people of my area. I've been told stories of the mountain since I was a kid. Basically, the summary of every story is, people are banished from the mountain because the spirits make it too dangerous. All sorts of weird things have been seen and have happened on this mountain. Last night, around 10:45 p.m, I heard 3 sets of sirens rush by the road. Out here, you never hear sirens. In my accumulative 15 years here, I've heard 1 siren and it was earlier this week. Basically, it just intrigued me at that point. Wasn't until about half an hour later or so and my power cuts out. I'm already in bed at this point. Lights were out. The only way I actually noticed was because I had no Wi-Fi. Now that's always a heartstopper. Because out here, no Wi-Fi means I'm entirely on my own. This makes me anxious for sure, but I'm more worried that I won't be able to call the fire department if something catches on fire than anything. Then out of nowhere, I hear this super sharp and loud cry like a kid who just crashed on a bike. Hysterical crying from what sounds to be a young child. My dogs are going absolutely nuts at the door. Now, if you're familiar with cougars or mountain lions, you should know that they can often mimic a child crying, and scary accurately too. So laying there as the tension builds, I'm just telling myself it's a cougar. That's all it is. Just a cougar. For me, that's the best case scenario right now, that it's just a cougar. Dogs have finally calmed down and I'm still just trying to get some shut-eye when I hear the second sound. This was an ungodly sound that I've never heard in my life. This one sounded like a mix of every horror movie monster all in one. I can't even describe it. It was about 5 seconds of pure screeching, like a demonic banshee with the vocal cords of a T-Rex. The bass to it shook my bed. It was as if there was a concert-sized sound system hiding in the forest blasting zombie vomit. I could taste my heartbeat at this point. My dogs are acting like rabies-ridden pit bulls towards the door, snarling and growling like whatever just screamed was on the other side of the door. I didn't know what to do at that point. Couldn't call or get in contact with anyone. Lights are all off. I'm just laying there in the dark, utterly and completely scared. I was not about to get up and go investigate. It's the middle of winter, of course, too. I just laid there checking my phone every 30 seconds, seeing if the Wi-Fi came back. Nothing else came after, though. Just ended up falling asleep at some point. As of this morning, everything is back to normal. Nothing creepy going on. Power's back on. Made a post in the local Facebook group, Nobody else in the area heard anything, and only a few lost power as well as me. So take it as you will. Cougar in heat, Bigfoot coming out of hibernation, 1,000-year-old native ghost trying to get me off his land. I'm not a very paranormal guy, and I have no idea what it could have been at this point. Update. Time to update and answer a few questions and ideas from everyone. So to start, it has been confirmed the sirens and the power was lost due to a motor vehicle incident into a power pole a kilometre or so down the road. Strangely enough, I've also found out that other siren a week or so ago was also responding to a multiple victim incident, but in almost the exact same spot. So take that as you will. I also decided to open Reddit for the first time to see all the comments at about 1 a.m. Terrible idea. You guys have all scared the crap out of me even more. But thank you as well. General update. Yes, to everyone mentioning it, I do have a generator. Problem is, it's up in the barn along with the Wi-Fi router. Definitely was not going to even open my bedroom door, let alone go outside after hearing that and go into the dark and creepy barn to screw around with the Jenny. I have checked around the walkable vicinity, no tracks or anything of interest that I found. Although I did not want to go searching through the forest for tracks, to be completely honest. As for gun protection, I would absolutely love to have a gun for this exact reason, but it's a hassle in Canada. And even if I did decide tomorrow was the day, it's a long process and I probably wouldn't have a gun until next winter, so that won't help me now. Cougar? As I said, the first one was definitely a cougar in my opinion. I have heard many cougars throughout my life, and they've made a lot of weird noises. But that second one, I just have a tough time accepting that noise as a cougar. In the defense of it being a cougar in heat though, the weather has been absurdly strange and very warm. Usually it's about -15 this time of year, but it's sitting at around 0 these past few weeks. This could cause some animals, including cougars, thinking it's spring concluding to some weird behaviour. Government lab. I have to unfortunately say this is most likely not the case. I have explored a lot of the mountain as trails in my back. 40 go onto Crown Land and up to the rest of the mountain. It's just logging and trails up there. My area is very boring and you would notice any type of suspicious vehicles coming in and around here, unless they're sneakily driving around mid-2000s rusted out Fords, because that's about 1/3 of the vehicles out here, myself included. I would really like to believe that it was some crazy one-off wild animal sound that was just freakishly close to my trailer. But a lot of these Bigfoot theories are very similar to what I experienced. I don't want to even think of the skinwalkers some of you are mentioning. Last night was okay. There was no noises and dogs stayed calm all night. Let me tell you though, I fell asleep with a podcast playing just to distract myself from the quiet. I will keep everyone updated if I have another experience or encounter out here. Thanks everybody. From the time our daughter was just about a year to just over 2 years old, we'd periodically get woken up to the sounds of her giggling to flat out cackling and squealing in excitement. When either of us would get up to see what the fuss was about, she'd be standing or sitting at any of the 3 sides of her crib, looking up. One day I was holding her and walking from each framed photo of family members. I'd point to those in the pics and say, "Who's that?" I pointed to her mom, myself, my mom, my mother-in-law, my sister-in-law, my brother, his wife. Each time she'd say her word for that person. There was a collage with a number of people, memories of the past my wife and I made and framed. There were family and friends who were no longer with us or passed on, including my father, who'd passed away a decade before our daughter was born. I started pointing at people, and if she didn't know them, she'd look at me real fast and hold the palms of her hands up like, I don't know. So I'd point to the person again and say their name. She'd do her best to repeat it. In the collage was a picture of my late father and I. I pointed to me. She said, Dada! I pointed to my father and she got all excited. She started bending her knees in my arms, raising up and down, giggling with the biggest smile. She raised her arms up in the air and looked at the ceiling and said loudly, Papa, Papa, Papa. She kept giggling and saying, Papa. I had chills, and my wife was looking at us with wide eyes. I started to tear up. For one, no one had ever shown her a photo of my father. We didn't have one hanging up in the rooms where she frequented. No reason. We just didn't have very many big photos of him. For two, she'd never said the word before. Not ever. Lastly, my brother lives halfway across the country, and at that time he had only seen my daughter once. He has one daughter, but she was in college when we visited him, so she'd never met our daughter. But my niece spent a lot of her early life around my late father before my brother relocated. Papa was what my niece called my father, and he loved being called that. Her reaction had my wife and I thinking, and admittedly hoping, that maybe, just maybe, all those times we had woken up to our daughter giggling or laughing and squealing in delight. It was my late father paying her a visit. Edit. This happened over 20 years ago. Our daughter is now 22 years old. So this happened a while back and it still creeps me out. I'm hoping this counts as a paranormal experience, because it was the most realistic one I've ever felt. I've heard the dead can visit us in human form, but I've always wondered if that's true. I was waiting tables at the restaurant I worked at one afternoon, and stopped by to greet a table that had an older woman and a man sitting together. When I spoke to them, the man was looking down, so I didn't notice him right away. The woman ordered her beverage, and I asked the man what he would like to drink. He looked up at me and said, "I'll take a Diet Pepsi." All I could do was stare. My dad passed away 26 years ago when I was a kid. But I swear on my life, the man sitting in front of me was the living, breathing version of him. Same face, same height and build, same voice, even the same gold tooth. I also don't have good memories of my dad because he was abusive to me and my mom. So I had a whole lot of emotions hit me at once. When I could finally speak, I managed to stammer out, "Okay, I'll be right back." I took their order and checked on them a couple times. When they paid, the man smiled at me with this twinkle in his eye that made me feel like it was my dad. He thanked me, but when he did, he didn't say the name listed on the receipt, my given name. Instead, he used my nickname, but I never told either of them my name at all. On Tuesday, I was remembering the charisma of a friend of mine I haven't seen for over a year. I even looked him up on social media to see what he's been up to and thought of messaging him to let him know I'd be in his city in March. Today, I see from another friend's Instagram story that he had in fact taken his own life the same day I'd been thinking of him. I'm both devastated by the news and shocked by the coincidence, or Otherwise? What does this mean? I used to be a tour guide in a popular tourist town in Tennessee. My job at the time was to take people on a circuitous 2-mile walk around the town, telling them the ghost stories of the people who had lived there. During the summer, tours started a little before sundown and would end well after dark. All in all, it would take us roughly 1 to 2 hours to get through a tour, depending on the walking speed of my group. Just to preface this, the vast majority of stories we told were not true. They were either largely exaggerated, entirely fabricated, or simply gruesome stories of local murders with a paranormal twist added at the end, with the ghost of the killer still lurking about. I didn't write the script, don't blame me. In fact, I visited a local museum and sourced authentic ghost stories from a curator in order to add a few of my own to the tour, which were actually authentic. That said, there were a handful of times during my stint as a tour guide in which I had experiences that were not so easily explained. In this post, I'm going to detail 3 of the most interesting ones. Story 1. One of the tools we got for our tours were EMF detectors, which I'm sure you're mostly all familiar with. They're intended to scan for electromagnetic frequencies and will detect the relative strength of a signal they pick up. Now, just because one of these things goes off doesn't mean you're seeing a ghost. They also pick up power lines and will go off like crazy near a generator. But if you're in the middle of nowhere and you suddenly get a strong signal, it's worth looking into. Now, these detectors we used had about 5 lights on them, changing in hue from green to yellow to red. Red meant no signal, and green indicates a strong signal. The light never goes below red unless you turn the thing off. That's the baseline. At the end of our tour, we would come to an old graveyard. Nobody buried there in at least 100 years. After I did my thing with the final story, people would wander around and look at the graves with flashlights and scare themselves shitless. But one night as they were wandering, a man called me over to see one of the graves. I went over and had a look and saw what the problem was. Whenever he passed his EMF detector over this particular grave, all the lights would turn off. The entire machine would turn itself off when it was over this grave and turn back on as soon as you moved it away. We tried with a couple other graves, but only this one had the effect. We were curious about the grave, so we tried to read the name of the person, but the headstone was too worn down for us to read it. The first name Thomas was faintly able to be read, but the surname was too hard to read. We had the whole group, 5 people, leaning over it at this point trying to read it when we all heard the same thing. As one of the group wondered aloud what the man's surname was, a loud voice from behind us shouted, "Whaley!" As you may have guessed, there was nobody behind us when we turned around, and we called the tour to a close shortly after that. I never messed with that specific grave again, except to place some flowers on it one time, as was my habit every once in a while since nobody visited that place anymore. Story 2. At the end of the tour, sometimes I would get tips if people had fun or got spooked. Older boomer and Gen X men really enjoy the charade of the covert handshake tip, where they palm you the money as they shake your hand. I always indulged the bit, because hey, I was getting a tip. One tour I ran had a family of 3, mother, father, daughter, and an older man who I initially thought was grandpa, but later learned had been lumped into their group because we didn't run solo tours. The old guy was pretty quiet throughout the tour, but would occasionally ask very pointed questions that stood out to me as odd. I don't remember most of his questions anymore. This was years ago. But one example is that I was telling a story of a girl who fell from a balcony, and her ghost haunts the river she plummeted into to this day. And he asked me if I thought she died right away when she hit the ground, or whether I thought she died slow and suffered. Just weird things like that. Well, at the end of the tour, the family took off into the graves to have a look about, see if ghosts would show up in their pictures, etc. The handshake was normal except that his hand was ice cold, but old folks have cold hands. So I didn't think about it too much. Except he didn't palm me $1. He palmed me a coin. I thought it was a $half when I felt it at first, but it was too big. I turned to glance at the guy as he walked past me to leave, and I shit you not, he was just gone. The path leaving the graveyard was downhill, and you had visibility from the top for at least 300 feet. There was no way he could have covered that distance in that time, and I didn't even hear running. Just this old, tottering man in front of me 1 second, and gone in the blink of an eye when he walked past me. When I got home and looked up the coin, I learned it was a 1 troy ounce silver bullion. Minted to an older year I don't remember exactly. I can check the year when I get home this evening if anyone cares. Overall, the experience left me a little shocked, and the family agreed he was really odd when I walked them back to their car. Apparently, the guy greeted their daughter by name when they arrived at the meetup spot a few minutes before me, but they had no idea who he was. Story 3. So 2 weird experiences, but no ghostly apparitions or demonic screams. Unfortunately, most nights on the ghost tour were entirely mundane. However, I have got one more odd story I experienced, which really set my belief of ghosts in stone. One of the earlier stops in our tour was an old cabin where the town's progenitor once lived. The cabin has been moved around a couple of times to build parking garages, but has since been placed back on its original spot. We don't actually have a photo of the woman who founded the town, but we have got pictures of her granddaughter, who everyone at the time swore was a dead ringer for her grandmother. Because of this, an old black and white photo of her granddaughter is on the sign outside the cabin. The cabin is kept locked up with a padlock at all times, except when the Historical Society opens it up for school groups. The windows are so dirty you can't see inside, and most of the time it's too dark to get a decent look inside anyway. Regardless, I like to encourage people to peek through the cracks in the old wood because they'd psyche themselves into thinking they saw something move, and a spooky tour is a tour with good tips. Anyway, one night after I did the whole spiel about her founding the town, and how people say they can see her ghost within the cabin on some nights to this day, I let them all have a go at peeking inside. One of the younger teens in the group approached me after looking inside, and we had a very odd conversation. These kids, 13, 16, usually think it makes them cool to be skeptical and show everyone they're not scared. So he asked me something like, "Who's in the costume?" I was a little confused and explained how the photo on the sign is a picture of the granddaughter of the town's founder, but that she wasn't wearing a costume. That was how people dressed at the time. The little shit rolled his eyes and told me he meant the woman in the cabin. Of course I had to have a look, so I peeked through, and sure enough, a streetlight was shining through the dirty windows and letting in a diffuse sort of light, and you could just make out a figure in a rocking chair sitting in the corner of the dark cabin, rocking back and forth. It was hard to get a good look at her, but from what I saw, she did look just like the woman in the photo. I moved the group on pretty fast, because quite frankly, I was a little afraid it was a homeless person who'd broken in somehow. If it was, I had a group of 6 kids and 1 parent, homeschoolers I think. I didn't want anybody getting hurt or snatched, but I stopped by the cabin again on the way to my car, and the lock was on tight and undamaged. I peeked inside again, and there wasn't even a rocking chair in the cabin. In the whole time I worked the tour route, roughly 2 years, I never saw a chair in that cabin again, or any old women for that matter. So anyway, those are my stories. I know they aren't as sensational as some, but I thought I'd share my experiences with you all. I have a few more odd stories that I can share if you like, but they're all more explainable by mundane means, if not still creepy and odd. When I was 19, my best friend was diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer. We knew her cancer was terminal and she had a life expectancy of 5 years at most. Her and I would talk every now and then about passing on and how even though I was healthy, I could always go before her in a car crash or some other way. We made a pact that no matter which one of us left first, we would come back to the other and let them know that there was more to life after death. She eventually passed away from her illness at 22 years old, leaving behind her husband and her 3-year-old son. She passed away on a Sunday at 8:20 a.m. I remember the call from her husband vividly. He asked me to bring her son to the hospital because she had passed away. That day was a complete blur. I couldn't find myself to come to the reality she was no longer with us. It all felt unreal. We were allowed to be with her for a few hours in her hospital room before she was taken away. But while we were there with her, I don't know, I was in complete shock, and my mind just couldn't process it. I didn't cry. Leaving the hospital was so strange, because at the time I had no children and my life revolved around my work, my home and her. She lived a few minutes from my job at the time, so I would always leave work very early to see her, whether she was at home or the hospital. I loved her so much. I could never be away from her. So now, knowing I had to go home and trying to process, I would never see her again, just threw my life for a spin. That night, I couldn't sleep. I just kept trying to make sense of it all. In all honesty, I don't even remember the thoughts that were going through my head, but the feelings of loss and confusion were very prevalent in me. I couldn't sleep at all. But at around 3 a.m, I felt the most beautiful and reassuring feeling I have ever felt. I felt what I can only describe as a warm hug take over me from head to toe, and I fell asleep. That night, I had a dream. In my dream, I called her husband to let him know that she had written me a letter. He then tells me that it's funny because she left him a voicemail. He then asks me to read him the letter. So I read it to him. In this letter, she tells us how thankful she is that we were in her life. She thanked us for taking care of her and loving her. She asks us to please watch over her son and that she is okay and is no longer in pain. She also tells us that we will be okay. As I finish telling him about the letter, my mom comes into my room and wakes me up. She asks me for pen and paper. I hand her a piece of paper I had and she starts to write. When she finishes, she hands it to me saying she didn't know why, but something told her to write this and give it to me. When I read the letter, it was word for word what my best friend told me in my dream, and she signed it with her father's last name. Now my mom only knew her by her mother's last name. No one outside her close relatives and myself knew her father's last name, so I was very confused as to how she signed it with her father's last name. I asked why or how she wrote this. My mom didn't know, she just wrote. I explained to her about my dream, and she was as surprised as I was. I immediately called her husband, and I told him about the letter and my dream. He agreed they were all her words. My best friend came through with her promise. This made me a believer. I know there's more after death. So, my dad died 5 years ago. It was a freak car accident while he and my older brother were driving home from some sports event they'd gone to. My dad was larger than life in every sense of the word. He was 6 feet 8 inches tall, covered in tattoos, and had this laugh that I swear you could hear across the country. He and his twin brother, they were identical, played so many pranks on us while growing up that we sort of just got used to it. That has not changed. Only now, dear Dad has the final laugh. Uncle was telling stories about Dad and some of their wild teenage years, and I remember so badly wanting to hug my dad. All of a sudden, my uncle and I hear the unmistakable sound of my dad laughing, followed by the back door slamming shut. Uncle and I stared at each other, wide-eyed, and then burst into laughter. Because yeah, that's my dad for you. The door, in case you're wondering, turned out to be locked. From the inside. Uncle and I were the only ones home at the time, outside of my Rottweiler beast, who cannot lock deadbolts, and it took an hour for us to find the spare key. My dad liked to move our spare key around because it makes it harder for robbers to find. He's continued to prank us over the years. Our keys go missing. Your phone will start blaring his favorite song at 3 a.m. out of nowhere. Or you'll wake up to the sound of my dog growling that distinctive rotty rumble that he only ever used while playing with my dad. His laughter is always heard as well as the scent of Old Spice, his favorite cologne. We miss him every day, but he always manages to remind us that he gets the last laugh nowadays. Back in the day, when my wife was alive, we promised to haunt each other should one or the other leave this life. We both firmly believe in an afterlife and spirits. So this wasn't just a silly, joking promise, even if there was some teasing about how we would do it to each other. I actually think we only said it twice. Well, it had been 2 years since she had left. I recall being in the room she died. The machines were breathing for her, and I felt her leave her body. Just gone with the sound of the machines still going. A few hours later, they were officially turned off. A little background information. My late wife had an eating disorder, and this disorder destroyed a lot of her gut and organs. It was a slow, painful death. When I say I felt her leave, it was like a bullet-fast leave. In life, I didn't yell, never a name call, rarely argued. And when we did, it was a healthy discourse, and decisions were made to settle it. I knew her ED had caused these problems, but what I didn't know was how much worse it really was. I found the information on her phone, post-death. She knew death was the final outcome years before I knew, and held back the information from me, letting me talk about growing old together. In short, I haven't seen her. Long post coming to an end. Fast forward 2 years, and I'm thinking of her. I shouted, "You did this to yourself, and I'm the one living with it. I fucking hate what you've done to me." Immediately in my brain from ear to ear, I heard her voice shout back, "It's about damn time." I felt 1,000 moving tingles going on inside my head. Needless to say, I cried the hardest I had ever done in 2 years since her passing. I, 27 female, live in the UK and have been a qualified nurse since 2018. I specialise in stroke and stroke rehabilitation, but also work in a private nursing home from time to earn some extra money. About 6 months ago, a new resident moved into the home. We can call her Jenny, for palliative care for her terminal bowel cancer. Whilst with us, Jenny found out that not only had her bowel cancer spread to her liver and lungs, but she also had brain metastasis and only had a few months left to live. After about 2 months with us, she started really freaking out when we would help her back to her room in the evening and get her comfortable for the night. She used to shout at us to be careful of the children or don't fall in the river. When asked what she was talking about, she explained to us she could see a river flowing through her room and lots of children playing in it. She wasn't necessarily scared of the children. She just didn't want us to stand on them and hurt them. The doctors and nurses all believed that she was hallucinating due to the brain metastases and the amount of opioid medication she was on. And we all made sure we didn't stand where she was pointing to. So we didn't stand on the children she could see. A couple of months ago, Jenny passed away peacefully, and I hadn't thought about the children or the river since. We asked her what she meant, as the home is very quiet at night, and she said, "Jenny." I froze. I again asked her what she meant, and she said, "Jenny and the children make so much noise when they're playing, and it keeps me up all night." I was in absolute shock, and have had trouble going in that room since. I've always been a skeptic, but I can't see any other logical explanation for this. I have asked other staff and nobody has mentioned Jenny or the children in the river to Sarah. Somebody please tell me there's another explanation for this.